My name is Elena Marsh, and the moment I saw my husband's signature on a loan document I never signed for, I understood that the man I married had been quietly planning to take the one thing that was never his to take. I was standing in the kitchen of my grandmother's house, the house she left to me and only me, holding a bank statement that shouldn't have existed. There was a second mortgage on the property. My name was typed neatly on the signature line. My handwriting was not. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had told me he wanted to invest in our future. He'd smiled when he said it, the same easy smile that made me fall for him 5 years ago. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? He was my husband. He managed our finances, handled the paperwork, took care of the things I didn't have time for while I was buried in blueprints and job sites. I had no idea that our future meant emptying the equity out of a house that had survived 3 generations of my family, a hurricane, a recession, and a fire that took half the roof in 1987 and left the rest standing anyway. I had no idea that 2 nights earlier, in the driveway, in a car I didn't recognize, Daniel had shaken hands with a man named Preston Cole, a name that would come to mean something very different to me by the end of the story. I had no idea that the woman at the county clerk's office who notarized that loan document had been 300 miles away in Charleston on the day her stamp claims she stood in my kitchen. And I had no idea, standing there with that statement shaking in my hand, that in less than 2 months, my husband would walk out of that house with nothing, not the equity, not the property, not even his dignity, while I stood on the porch my grandmother built, watching him go. But to understand how a marriage built on quiet trust turned into a battlefield over 4 walls and a wraparound porch, you have to go back to the beginning. Back before the forged signature. Back before Preston Cole. Back to the spring morning my grandmother handed me a key and told me something I wouldn't understand the weight of for another 3 years. My grandmother, Ruth Ellery, built her life the hard way. She raised 2 children alone in Asheville, North Carolina, worked as a seamstress by day and took in mending by night, and in 1974 she bought a rundown Victorian on Maple Ridge with money she'd saved $1 at a time. She restored it herself, board by board, over 20 years. It wasn't just a house. It was proof that she had survived. When she died, she left it to me. Not to my mother, not to my older brother, but to me specifically with a note that read, "You're the one who understands what it costs to build something. Don't ever let anyone talk you out of it." At the time, I thought she meant the renovation work I did for a living. I designed structural restorations for historic homes, the kind of job where you spend your days convincing contractors that a 100-year-old load-bearing wall deserves more respect than they're giving it. I thought she was talking about my career. I didn't understand she might have been warning me about something else entirely. I married Daniel Vance 2 years after my grandmother passed. He was charming in the way that made people trust him instantly, a mortgage broker with a talent for making complicated financial language sound simple and safe. He complimented my work, remembered small details about my life, and never once, in the beginning, made me feel like the money or the house or the decisions were his to make instead of mine. We moved into Ruth's house together the year we got married. Daniel called it a beautiful investment. I called it home. For the first 2 years, things were good. Daniel handled our joint checking account and the household bills, which felt reasonable since he worked in finance, and I barely had time to answer my own emails, let alone reconcile a budget. I trusted him with the numbers the same way I trusted a structural engineer's calculations on a job site, not because I couldn't check the math myself, but because that wasn't where my attention needed to go. That trust is exactly what made it so easy for him to walk right past me. The first sign came in March, though I didn't recognize it as a sign at the time. Daniel started coming home later, always with a reasonable explanation, a difficult client, a broker's dinner, a training session downtown. He'd mention a name here and there. Preston. Just Preston, no last name, no explanation of who he was, just a first name dropped into conversation the way you'd mention a coworker you assumed your spouse already knew about. I didn't ask. That was my mistake, if you can call trusting your husband a mistake. The second sign came in April, when I found a manila folder in his desk drawer while looking for a stapler. Property appraisal documents. Not for a house, for 3 other properties on Maple Ridge, all within 2 blocks of ours. I remember standing there, flipping through pages of comparable sales data, thinking it was strange, but not alarming. Daniel worked in mortgages. Maybe a client was buying in the neighborhood. I put the folder back exactly where I found it and didn't mention it, because that's what you do when you trust someone. You give them the benefit of the doubt even when a small voice in the back of your mind is asking questions you don't want to answer yet. The third sign is the one I can't forgive myself for missing, because it wasn't subtle at all. In May, a city notice arrived in the mail addressed to both of us. A rezoning announcement. The block containing Maple Ridge, including our address, had been flagged for a mixed-use development review. A private developer had submitted preliminary plans to purchase and combine several adjoining lots into a boutique retail corridor. Daniel intercepted the mail that day. I only found out about the notice because a neighbor mentioned it to me at the farmer's market 3 weeks later, casually, assuming I already knew. "Exciting, isn't it?" she said. "Preston Cole's company is talking real money for these lots. I heard the Hendersons are already in talks to sell." Preston Cole. There was that name again. I went home and asked Daniel directly, for the first time, who Preston Cole was. He didn't flinch. He told me Preston was a developer he'd met through a mutual client, that yes, there'd been some interest in the block, and that he hadn't mentioned it because he didn't want me to worry about something that probably wouldn't go anywhere. He said it so smoothly, so reasonably, that I believed him. I even remember feeling a small flicker of guilt for having doubted him at all. That's the thing about a lie told by someone who loves you or who you believe loves you. It doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like reassurance. I wouldn't learn the truth about Preston Cole, or what Daniel had actually promised him, for another 6 weeks. And when I did, it wouldn't come from Daniel at all. It would come from a stranger, standing on my porch, holding a clipboard, asking to speak to the owner of record, and looking confused when I told him that was me. The man on the porch introduced himself as Rick Alvarez, a site surveyor. He'd been sent to confirm boundary lines for a property assembly project, Preston Cole's project, and he was under the impression that the sale of 214 Maple Ridge had already been verbally agreed upon, pending finalization of financing. I told him there had been no agreement. I told him the house wasn't for sale. He apologized, said there must be some confusion, and left me standing on the porch with my heart pounding and a business card in my hand that read Cole Development Group, Preston Cole, Principal. I didn't confront Daniel that night. I've built my entire career on the principle that you don't tear into a wall until you understand exactly what's holding it up. If I was wrong about what was happening, I'd blow up my marriage over a misunderstanding. If I was right, I needed proof before I said a single word, because I already had a sinking feeling that the man across the dinner table from me was a much better liar than I'd ever given him credit for. So I started paying attention the way I pay attention on a job site, quietly, methodically, looking for the crack before it becomes a collapse. I requested a copy of our credit report. It came back showing an active loan application in both our names, filed 6 weeks earlier, for a home equity line of credit against 214 Maple Ridge. I had never applied for it. I had never signed anything. I drove to the bank branch listed on the report and asked, calmly, to see the signed documentation for the account, explaining I wanted to review the terms. The loan officer, a woman named Patrice, pulled the file without hesitation and slid it across the counter. There it was. My name, printed and signed, on a document authorizing $140,000 against the equity in my grandmother's house. The funds, disbursed 3 weeks earlier, had gone into an account I didn't recognize. The signature looked close. Close enough that most people wouldn't look twice. But I've spent a decade studying the small details that other people overlook. The hairline crack in a foundation, the slight give in a floorboard that tells you rot is already spreading beneath it. My real signature has a specific loop on the E, a habit left over from calligraphy lessons my grandmother made me take as a girl. This signature didn't have it. Whoever signed my name had never seen me write it in cursive even once. I asked Patrice, who had notarized the document. She pointed to a name at the bottom, Carroll and Whitfield, Notary Public, with a stamped date of April 9th. I remembered that date because April 9th was my brother's wedding. Daniel and I had both been in Charleston, South Carolina, for the entire weekend. There were photographs. There was a hotel receipt. There was no possible way I had been standing in a bank in Asheville, signing loan documents while I was 300 miles away giving a toast to my brother's reception. That was the moment the sinking feeling turned into something colder and more certain. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was fraud, and my husband had either committed it himself or allowed someone else to commit it on his behalf, and either way, he had let a stranger forge my name to steal equity out of my grandmother's house. I didn't say a word to Daniel. Instead, I called my brother's college roommate, a family law attorney named Marcus Odom, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said something I've never forgotten. "Elena, don't confront him yet. The second he knows you're onto this, he'll start covering his tracks, and forged documents have a way of disappearing overnight. Get everything you can first, then we talk." For the next 10 days, I became a detective in my own home. I found a second phone in Daniel's gym bag, a prepaid one, with a thread of text to Preston Cole that made my stomach turn. "She won't sign it willingly. We'll meet another way." Another message, sent the week before the notarized loan appeared. "Carol and says she can backdate it. Just need the info." Carol and the notary. Not a stranger who happened to forge my name, a person Daniel knew, someone he'd apparently paid or persuaded to falsify a legal document and lie about her own whereabouts to make fraud look legitimate. I found something else, too, tucked into a folder on his laptop labeled, almost mockingly, "House Stuff." A draft purchase agreement between Daniel Vance and Cole Development Group for 214 Maple Ridge, at a price nearly $400,000 above what we'd paid, with a note in the margin in Daniel's handwriting. Once the hell it clears and he signs off on the sale, we split the difference. He wasn't planning to steal the house outright. He was planning to drain the equity, pressure me into agreeing to sell under financial strain he'd manufactured himself, and walk away with half of a windfall built entirely on my grandmother's life's work he had never once helped fund, maintain, or earn. I sat with that folder open on my lap for a long time. Then I closed the laptop, and I called Marcus back. "I have everything," I told him. "Now tell me what to do." Marcus laid out the plan carefully, the same way I'd walk a client through a structural repair. Identify every point of failure before you touch a single beam. Forged notarization was a felony. Wire fraud, potentially, given the funds had crossed bank lines. But he warned me that proving Daniel's direct involvement, rather than Carol Ann's alone, would require more than a folder of texts and a mismatched signature. We needed him to admit it on the record, in a way he couldn't later explain away. So, I did something I never imagined myself capable of. I played along. For 2 weeks, I let Daniel believe he was winning. I mentioned casually that the market seemed strong right now. I asked him, over dinner, what he thought the house might be worth if we ever considered selling. I watched him try to hide his excitement, watched him lean forward for the first time in months with real interest in a conversation with me. Marcus had me wearing a small recorder clipped inside my blazer, legal under North Carolina's one-party consent law, for every one of those conversations. Daniel talked more than he should have. Men who believe they've already won tend to do that. He told me the Helic had already gone through smoothly. He told me Preston was ready to move fast once I signed off. He told me, in a moment I will never forget, that he'd known this house would be worth a fortune. The second your grandmother's obituary mentioned the zoning changes coming to Maple Ridge, meaning he had been planning this since before we were even married a full 2 years, since before I had grieved my grandmother. Since before I had any reason to suspect the man proposing to me had done the math on my inheritance before he'd ever done the math on our relationship. That recording became the centerpiece of everything. Marcus and I brought the full picture to the district attorney's office. The forged signature, the falsified notarization with Carol Ann's provable absence from the state, the prepaid phone messages, the draft agreement with Preston Cole, and the recorded admission. It was enough. Carol Ann Whitfield's notary license was suspended within the month, and she was charged with falsifying a public document. Preston Cole's company quietly withdrew from the Maple Ridge Assembly project entirely once his name surfaced in a fraud investigation tied to a residential property he didn't own. Developers, it turns out, are far less interested in a deal once it comes with a criminal case attached. But it was the house itself that mattered most, and this is where my grandmother's warning finally made sense. When I went through her old paperwork in the safety deposit box she left me, I found something I had never known existed, a codicil to her will, filed quietly the same year she wrote her note about not letting anyone talk me out of anything. It stated, in plain legal language, that any transfer, lien, or encumbrance placed on the property, without the sole written consent of the named heir, verified in person by her longtime attorney, a man named Everett Pruitt who is still practicing at 81 years old, would be automatically voidable. My grandmother, it turned out, had anticipated exactly this kind of betrayal decades before it happened. Not because she knew Daniel, because she'd lived long enough to understand what people are capable of when property and love get tangled together. Everett Pruitt, once he confirmed the fraud, moved to void the Hellick entirely on the grounds of both forgery and the codicil. The bank, facing a documented case of notarized fraud, reversed the loan and absorbed the loss rather than risk a public case implicating one of their own contracted notaries. Daniel was charged as an accessory to the forgery once the recordings and the messages made his involvement undeniable. He avoided prison through a plea agreement, but he lost his mortgage broker's license permanently, and he lost something else, too. Every shred of the reputation he built on being the reasonable, trustworthy man in the room. I filed for divorce the same week the loan was voided. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I finally understood what my grandmother had been trying to tell me all those years ago. Building something, a house, a career, a life, takes patience, and protecting it takes something even harder, the willingness to see clearly, even when clear sight costs you the comfortable version of a story you wanted to believe. Daniel moved out on a Tuesday in late September. I remember it was raining, the kind of soft, steady Asheville rain that used to make my grandmother put on a pot of coffee and sit on the porch to watch it fall. He didn't take much: his clothes, his prepaid phone long since surrendered to the DA's office, a box of books he'd never actually read. He didn't take the equity. He didn't take the sale. He didn't take the house. He left with nothing that had ever truly belonged to him, because none of it ever had. I stood on that porch after his car disappeared down Maple Ridge, the same porch my grandmother built with her own hands 40 years earlier, and I finally understood the last line of her note in a way I hadn't been ready to before. Don't ever let anyone talk you out of it. She hadn't just meant the house. She'd meant everything you build with your own two hands, your work, your judgment, your right to trust your own eyes even when someone you love is telling you not to look too closely. I still live in that house. I repainted the porch railing last spring, the same shade of blue my grandmother always used, and some mornings I still sit out there with a cup of coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up in a house that is and will always remain entirely and only mine.